Most anglers pick the lure first and then go looking for water that fits it. The good ones do it backwards. They read what is in front of them, and by the time they reach the rod, the lure has already been chosen for them. There is nothing mystical about that. They are running a sequence, and the sequence is short. 7 questions. That is the whole thing. Answer them in order, and a wall of 200 lures collapses into 2 or 3 that could actually work today. By the end of this, you will have that sequence. You will have run it against 5 real situations before I give you the answer. And somewhere in the middle, you are going to find out that the number printed on almost every lure package in America is not the number that decides whether a fish can eat it. Question 1. Where are the fish in the water column? Not where on the lake. That is a different problem and a different day. I mean the vertical answer. Top, middle, or bottom. Here is the part nobody says out loud in the aisle. Every lure family you have ever bought is a depth tool wearing a costume. A popper is a surface tool. A square bill is a 2 to 5 foot tool. A suspending jerkbait is a hovering tool. A jig is a bottom tool. The paint is what sells it. The depth is what it does. Answer the vertical question first, because getting it wrong cannot be fixed by anything else. A fish sitting 12 feet down on a cold morning is usually not going to climb 12 feet for a beautiful surface bait, and you can spend 3 hours proving that. 2 free ways to answer it. Count your bait down while it sinks, and watch for the line to go slack, and now you have the count for that depth at that spot. Then let the bait tick. Bumping bottom the whole way means you are in the basement. Touching nothing all day means you are in the attic, and most people fish the attic and call it a slow bite. Depth takes half the box out of play in 90 seconds, but the next question takes out half of what is left, and the packages will barely help you with it. Hold that. We are coming back to it, and it is the part of this video I would rewind. Question 2. What are they eating, and where does that food live? Notice I did not ask which species. Anglers spend a lot of money matching a species and almost no time matching a posture. Freshwater forage lives at 3 addresses. Bottom crawlers, crawfish, sculpin, gobies, low, nose down, hugging rock, and when they flee, they do it in short, scared hops. Suspended baitfish, shad, shiners, young bluegill, horizontal, mid-column, and when they panic, they scatter sideways and flash. Surface and edge prey, frogs, insects falling in, small fish pushed against the ceiling and trapped there. Now look at your box again. A jig is not a crawfish because it is brown. It is a crawfish because it goes down nose first and stops. A paddle-tail swimbait is not a shad because it is silver. It is a shad because it holds horizontal and keeps a steady tail beat. Posture is the imitation. Color is the accessory. So do a 5-minute forage census before your first cast. Walk the shallow edge and look. Turn a rock over if the rules where you are allow it. Look under a dock light. Watch what skips when you scare it. You are not identifying a species. You are answering one question. Is the food here on the bottom, in the middle, or on top? That answer tells you the posture your lure has to hold, and posture narrows a tackle box faster than any color chart ever printed. Question 3. How active are they? Most fish are ectotherms. Their metabolism follows the water around them. Cold water means a slower engine, and a slower engine means a fish that will not travel as far and will not spend energy on a low percentage attempt. So activity is not a mood. It is a distance. It is how far a fish will move to eat and how much it will commit when it gets there. A cheap stem thermometer costs about $12 once and will tell you more on a spring morning than a whole new box of plastic. You can also read the fish itself, for free. A fish that follows and turns is interested and not committed. A fish that hammers it and hooks itself in the roof of the mouth is telling you the engine is running hot. And here is a promise for later, because this one catches everybody. The exact same lure can be the right answer at 7 in the morning and completely wrong by 10, without the fish changing species, changing location, or changing what it eats. Nothing moved. The answer moved. I will show you why at the end. Question 4. How easily can they detect it? I made a whole video on the color side of this, so I am going to stay off color here and give you the piece almost nobody covers. Distance. Detection is a budget. In clean water, a fish can notice your bait from a long way off, so you can cover water and let them come to you. As clarity drops, that budget shrinks, and the bait has to be found rather than admired. When the budget shrinks, you have 4 levers, and 3 of them are free. Pass closer. Tighten the spacing of your casts around a piece of cover instead of spreading them out. Pass again. Second and third pass on the same limb, from a different angle. Pass slower, as long as slower does not kill the action that makes the lure work. Or push more water. A wider blade, a bulkier body, a harder thumping tail. In dirty water, you are not only asking to be seen, you are asking to be felt. 3 of those 4 cost nothing, and the 4th is probably already in your box. None of them come in packaging. None of them get a spring release. That is most of the reason a new color reaches you every February, and a tighter casting pattern never does. It is not a plot. A shade fits on a peg hook. A casting pattern does not. Question 5. What size and what profile? Here is the payoff I promised, and I want to state it properly rather than turn it into a slogan. A study published in PLOS One in 2018, led by Jeremy Gaeta at Utah State University, with Jake Vander Zanden at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and funded through the United States Geological Survey, pooled diet datasets from lakes in Alberta, Illinois, Minnesota, New York, and Wisconsin. Samples were gathered by gastric lavage, by the tube method, and by dissection. Largemouth, smallmouth, walleye, northern pike, muskellunge, crappie, and rock bass. For walleye alone, the dataset held 18,102 predator and prey length observations. The median prey length generally landed around 10 to 20% of the predator's own length. The maximum ingested prey length varied by species and size, and the middle half of their estimates ran about 32 to 46%. And this is the one that should stop you. Across nearly every species and nearly every size of predator in the study, the most common prey length fell in a narrow band of roughly 16 to 73 millimeters. That is about 6/10 of an inch to just under 3 inches. Large muskellunge were the notable exception. Read that again in tackle terms. A 20-inch walleye and a 12-inch walleye were most often eating out of the same small band. 2 more findings change what you tie on. First, predators in these systems rarely fed anywhere near their gape limit. What a fish can physically swallow and what it habitually eats are 2 different numbers, and the wall has been selling you the first one. Second, and this is the piece the package cannot tell you, prey shape mattered. Slim torpedo-shaped prey were eaten at larger relative lengths than deep-bodied, laterally compressed prey. The same fish that will eat a long, skinny minnow will only eat a much shorter version of something tall and slab-sided. Older work points the same way. Kenneth Hambright, publishing in Transactions of the American Fisheries Society in 1991 out of Cornell, found that prey body depth measured against the predator's mouth gape can be a better predictor of what gets eaten than prey length alone. In those trials, largemouth bass did not ingest prey with a body depth greater than their own external mouth width, and they preferred prey well below the largest size they could have taken. Now the boundaries, because I would rather hand you less and have it hold. These are diet observations. They tell you what was realized, not what was preferred, and prey availability shapes that. A lure is not prey, and a reaction strike is not a feeding decision. Handling time work by Hoyle and Keast shows that prey shape and size change how long a bass takes to deal with a meal, which is a real cost, but nobody has demonstrated that a bass followed your swimbait and turned away because it did the arithmetic. That is a plausible field explanation, not a finding. Big bait, big fish is memorable advice. The actual diet data show a much more complicated picture. So what does that change on Saturday morning? 3 things, and you can do all of them tonight. 1. Stop reading the length on the front of the bag and start measuring the height of the bait. Stand each lure up and measure belly to back. That is the dimension that has to fit a mouth, and I have never once seen it printed on a package. A quarter is just under 1 inch across. Use it as a ruler at the bank. 2. Run 2 ceilings, not 1. Slim baits are allowed to be longer. Deep-bodied baits have to be shorter to sit in the same window. 3. Let the fish you catch set the window. Bring in a 16-inch base, and the middle of that range puts its everyday food somewhere around 1.5 to just over 3 inches, with the occasional meal running a lot bigger. Now count how many baits you own inside that window. For most people, the answer is embarrassing. Question 6. Which lure family sends that signal, at that depth, at that size? Now the wall is finally useful, because you are not shopping, you are matching a job to a tool. Here is every major family, what it says to a fish, when it wins, and when it quietly wastes your afternoon. Walking baits and poppers. Signal, a wounded thing trapped against the ceiling. They shine in low light, on calm or lightly rippled water, in warm temperatures. Anytime you see fish pushing bait upward, they fail in cold water, heavy chop, and over deep fish that will not climb. Retrieve is rhythm, not speed. Steady cadence for a walker. For a popper, spit it, then leave it alone longer than feels comfortable. Suspending jerkbaits. Signal, a bait fish that has lost its balance and cannot get away. The specialist for cold, clear water, neutral fish, and anything suspended in the middle of the column. Fails in heavy cover, very dirty water, and on fish glued to the bottom. Retrieve is 2 or 3 sharp twitches, and then a stop, and the stop is the whole bait. Let it hang crooked. Diving crankbaits and square bills. Signal, a fleeing baitfish that keeps making mistakes. They shine on hard bottom, rock, gravel, stumps, and laydowns, wherever fish will chase. They fail in slop and in very cold water. Retrieve is contact. A crankbait that never touches anything is only half a lure. Make it hit the rock and deflect. Lipless crankbaits. Signal, a panicked shad with a tight vibrating body. They shine on grass flats, open flats in cool water, and any time you need distance at a fixed depth. They fail in shallow rock where they hang up, and in ultra-clear pressured water where the rattle works against you. Retrieve is yo-yo it, or better, snap it free every time it grabs grass. That rip out of the weeds is the trigger. Spinnerbaits. Signal, a small school of bait and a lot of displaced water. They shine in stained and dirty water, in wind, around wood, on shallow banks. They fail in clear, calm water where the hardware becomes obvious. A round blade thumps and is the dirty water choice. A long willow blade flashes and slides through grass. Retrieve is a slow roll with the blade turning right at the edge of what you can feel. Vibrating jigs. Signal, a hard, erratic thump with a compact body behind it. They shine in stained water and sparse grass, in that window where a spinnerbait feels too visible and a crankbait cannot get through. They fail in thick matted cover and in very cold water. Retrieve is steady, then let it clip the grass and tear free. Swimbaits. Signal, a calm, healthy horizontal baitfish. They shine in clear water, on suspended fish, when the forage is obvious and you are matching it. They fail in dirty water, because a subtle tail beat cannot be found. Retrieve is boring on purpose, steady, straight, unremarkable, with the occasional pause. Jigs. Signal, a compact meal dropping into a place a big fish already wants to sit. Best bottom tool there is. Shines in cover, cold water, pressured fish, rock, docks, and laydowns. Fails when fish are chasing bait up in the column, and fails when you fish it too fast. Retrieve is drag, hop, leave it. Most jig bites happen on the fall. Soft plastic worms and finesse rigs. Signal, something small, alive, and not going anywhere in a hurry. Shines under pressure, in clear water, in high sun, anytime everything else has been refused. Fails when you need to cover water fast. Retrieve is slow, and mostly rod tip, not reel handle. Spoons. Signal, pure flash and an erratic falling body. Shines in deep water on vertical fish, and for pike and trout in open water. Fails in shallow cover. Retrieve is a lift and a controlled drop. 10 families. Every one of them is a specific answer to a specific condition, and not one of them is the best lure. There is no such thing. Which brings me to a man in Finland with a shoemaker's knife. In the 1930s, Lauri Rapala was fishing Lake Paijane to feed his family. He watched schools of minnows day after day, and he noticed that when a predator came through, it did not take the fastest minnow, or the biggest one, or the prettiest one. Again and again it took the one swimming slightly off balance. So in 1936, he carved a lure out of cork with a shoemaker's knife, wrapped it in foil off chocolate wrappers, and coated it in melted photographic negatives because he had no lacquer. It was not a beautiful object. What it had was a wobble that was slightly wrong. And that is the principle underneath this whole video. A lure does not have to look like food. It has to behave like food worth catching. There is a corollary I will give you, as a field rule, rather than as science, because I have not seen it properly tested. A lure that swims perfectly straight and strong is doing an excellent impression of a healthy fish, and a healthy fish is the expensive one to chase. Sometimes the most realistic bait in your box is the least believable meal in the lake. 5 situations. Conditions first, then a couple of seconds to answer in your head, then what I would tie on and what I would not. 1. Cold, clear reservoir. Bass suspended about 8 feet down. The bait in the area is around 2 inches. Little wind. They follow the lure and will not commit. Suspending jerkbait. Slim, small, natural. Cold plus neutral plus suspended is the exact address of that bait, and the follow tells you they will not spend energy, so stop asking them to. Twitch, twitch, then hang it in place for 5 or 6 seconds. What I would not throw is a 5-inch deep-bodied swimbait. Wrong window, wrong profile, and the follows will keep coming right up to your feet. 2. Farm pond the morning after heavy rain. Water the color of coffee. Warm. Fish are tight to shallow wood you can see from the bank. Vibrating jig, or a spinnerbait with a round blade. This is a detection problem, not a color problem. Compact body, hard thump, and here is the part most people skip. Cut your casting spacing in half and make 3 passes on the same stump from 3 angles. That fish is not going to find a bait 15 feet away. What I would not throw is a subtle finesse worm. Lovely bait that nobody down there will ever know arrived. 3. Midsummer. Mid-morning, sun climbing. A big grass flat with a clean outer edge. Sunfish everywhere in the shallows. Lipless crankbait ripped across the top of the grass, or a swim jig. And notice this is the one situation on the list where a deeper-bodied, taller profile is exactly right, because the forage in front of you is a sunfish, which is a slab. Match the shape of the food, not just its length. Retrieve is steady until it loads up with grass, then a sharp snap to tear it loose. 4. Rocky riverbank. Steady current. Crawfish under every stone. Water in the low 60s. Jig, or a square bill crankbait, and the reason is posture. Both go down nose first and both deflect off rock. Cast upstream and let the current carry it in so the bait arrives the way real food does. What I would not throw is a horizontal swimbait high in the column. Right lake, wrong address. 5. Calm summer evening. Flat water. You can see fish pushing bait against the surface in the last hour of light. Walking bait. Size to what is popping. If those are 2-inch shad, do not tie on a 6-inch topwater because it is the one you enjoy throwing. And this is the loop I opened earlier. That same walking bait, thrown at 10 in the morning over the same fish in bright sun, would be the wrong answer entirely. Nothing about the fish changed. The light changed, the fish slid down and into shade, and the vertical answer moved with them. That is the whole reason the sequence exists. You are not choosing a lure once. You are re-answering 7 questions, and some of the answers change every couple of hours. So here is the sequence, and I would write it inside your tackle box lid. Where are they in the water column? What are they eating, and does that food live on the bottom, in the middle, or on top? How active are they, and how far will they travel? How easily can they detect it from where they are sitting? What size and what profile fits, measuring height and not just length? Which lure family sends that signal at that depth? And what retrieve makes it believable? 7 questions, 2 minutes in the parking lot. And the reason this framework is not hanging on the wall next to the lures is that it does not sell anything. A percentage of body length cannot be trademarked. A tighter casting fan does not come in a blister pack. Measuring the height of a bait you already own has no barcode. Stop asking what the best lure is. Ask what job the lure has to do in the next 30 minutes, in this exact water, in front of this exact fish. Answer that and the tackle wall stops being a wall. It becomes a toolbox where you finally know what each one is for. 2 things I want in the comments, and I want the argument, not the agreement. First, I think most anglers are throwing baits that are too big, most of the time, and blaming color for it. Tell me I am wrong, and give me a number. What was the actual length of the lure that caught the biggest fish of your life? Second, which one of those 7 questions do you think should come first on your water? I put depth at number 1. I know people who catch a lot of fish who would put forage first and argue hard about it. Before you go, licenses, seasons, size and harvest limits, gear and bait restrictions, and rules on moving live bait or live fish between waters change by state, by county, and sometimes lake to lake. Check your state and local regulations before you fish, every time. Handle lead sensibly, and watch your footing on wet rock. Forbidden Lures is independent. No affiliate links, no brand payments, no sponsored placements, and every source is named so you can go read it yourself. Next trip out, before you open the box. 7 questions. The lure was never the decision. It was only ever the answer.